Ladies and gentlemen, President Emeritus of the United States, James Madison.
Thank you for that introduction. Brevity is the soul of wit, as Shakespeare said. Ladies and gentlemen, citizens of the United States, you occupy the highest office in the land. History is biography. And looking at this august audience, I'm reminded of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, when the destiny of the nation was charted by those who were not summer soldiers and sunshine patriots, but were committed to a new form of government where we, the people, were sovereign, where our rights were not the indulgence of some omnipotent potentate, and that the rule of law was king, the king was not law. And I feel, addressing this audience today, we are encountering a similar inflection point in history. We have lost over the past centuries virtually everything that we postulated should be the fundamentals of who we are as a people and what we want as good and enlightened government: justice. And what I propose to do today is try to inspire you with an understanding that you hold the destiny of the nation in your hands. A majority is one man or woman with courage. It doesn't matter what the numbers are. If we adhere to the principles, what George Washington at the Constitutional Convention, he was the presiding president, said, to establish a standard to which the wise and honest may repair. We may reclaim the republic that was established centuries ago. Now, many would say, why are we resorting to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, these documents that were drafted and ratified centuries before? There were trains, there were airplanes, there were satellites, there was the internet. It said what these ideas must be outmoded because they didn't anticipate these changes in science and technology. But that, it seems to me, is fatuous to suggesting that the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Pythagorean theory, Copernicus, Galileo, Aristotle, Plato are outmoded because they didn't write at the time of the internet. The examination that we undertook at the Constitutional Convention, and myself in particular, studying the history of all confederations and the history of the world, were built on universals of human nature. Those temptations to despotism, to arbitrariness, to oppression that afflict every generation because they are part of the human species. And building on these universals that are timeless, we crafted the Constitution of the United States and drafted, in anticipation of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. And I'd like to go back to those first principles to impress upon you what was so ennobling about those ideas and concepts and why we need to return to those very, very glorious days. Number one, the most revolutionary idea in the history of the world at that time, in the Declaration of Independence, that we the people are sovereign, that our rights are not at the indulgence of some individual king or queen, and that the sole purpose of government, the sole purpose is to protect the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It wasn't to build big government. It wasn't to give us creature comforts. It wasn't to build empires. But that was the ennobling idea of the Declaration and of the Constitution of the United States. Now, I wrote in the Federalist Papers that justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society enlightenment. Now, justice may be elusive because there are oftentimes trade-offs that make a particular demarcation line between one's rights and another's very difficult. But that is the goal. It's not the goal to dominate others by the sense of force. It's not the goal to build a big government that showers people with handouts and dependencies and subsidies and things like that. It is justice. And notice that I omitted stating that the goal of government is to have a certain unemployment rate, to have a certain per capita GNP. Those may be subsidiary benefits, and I believe they are. They're the offspring of the rule of law and a commitment to these principles. But that's not the higher order that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence sought. And think of where we are today with regard to these fundamental ideas of government. We now have a president who can assassinate us under the rubric of legality based on secret facts and secret law. the very definition of tyranny. King George III would have been jealous of those powers, remember? And we overthrew him. We overthrew him. The President of the United States can detain on American soil through the use of the military any citizen on his say-so alone. Send him to Guantanamo Bay, Bagram prison, or elsewhere without any right to habeas corpus. It is a frightening power. And when the President of the United States signed this bill, the National Defense Authorization Act, his only promise was, I won't really use it in a draconian fashion. I'll just get the worst of the worst. Again, the mentality that all of our rights are his indulgence. No, we have that right because we're born citizens of the United States. It's not dependent upon a benevolent president. And we can think of all sorts of candidates for the presidency that we'd be frightened about if our liberties depended upon them. And I don't need to identify the individuals whose egomania would suggest they would be more like Caligula, you know, than Caesar Augustus. It's frightening to contemplate. But these are the things, architects, that we've let go. What about the war power? I spent almost half of the Federalist Papers worrying about standing armies, the death knell of republics from the beginning of history, worried about how we could control the inevitable temptation of countries to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy whenever that power was entrusted with the executive. Because all of history had shown that the executive branch will concoct dangers and fears to engage in war because all the power then gravitates to the executive. The taxes, the spending, the contracts, the ability to leave your footprints in the sands of time. And that is perhaps the most intoxicating thing about being the president who conducts wars. Wow, I will change the world forever. That's what Napoleon thought right outside of Moscow. Didn't quite turn out that way. And those powers that were entrusted solely to Congress because it did not confront a conflict of interest, because during wartime, congressional powers shrink. And so not only myself, but my big rival at that time between a legislative and executive power, Alexander Hamilton, all agreed. We cannot entrust the decision to go from a state of peace to war, not only to the president alone, but to no group of men, including the Senate and the president, with a treaty, like the UN treaty. Only when the House of Representatives concurs will we go from a state of peace to a state of war. And the reason why the threshold was high is because in wartime, the law is silent. Cicero said, in times of war, the law is silent. It doesn't really matter whether you have codes of international behavior. Everybody recognizes when people's lives are on the line, they will inevitably react to anything that moves with shooting. In some sense, that's understandable. You're putting your life on the line, you don't take second guesses. And that's what we see all around the world. That's why William Tecumseh Sherman described war as hell. And I think anybody who's been on the battlefield will be able to describe how indiscriminate the killing becomes in the midst, the fog of war, if you will. And that's not to say that we will never go to war. I, as President of the United States, asked Congress to authorize warfare against Great Britain, the War of 1812, because they were impressing our sailors, kidnapping them, and destroying without cause our international shipping. So there are times, but I, of course, asked Congress to exercise that decision. I didn't do it unilaterally, and during the war, I didn't try to expand executive power. There was no reprise of the Alien Sedition Act under my watch. In fact, during the time of war, free speech is more important rather than less, because you're inclined in that state of fear to make miscalculations. You need critics to check the folly, the belief that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Politics will come back and redeem you. That's why I protected speech, not tried to suppress it during wartime. And now we have a situation, the president has usurped the war power wholesale. The most recent conflict, the president didn't even bother to get any congressional appropriations to fight a war in Libya. None. He used counterterrorism funds to undertake so-called a humanitarian mission. Sort of a contradiction in terms, a humanitarian war. You're killing people in order to liberate them. And we understood that in writing the Constitution of the United States. In some sense, we may have been led into a sense of complacency because we knew the first president was going to be George Washington. Someone who renounced royal power, who had to be dragged out of Mount Vernon to come serve as the president, rather than candidates today who race to the White House, you know? Although they claim they're like Cincinnatus from Georgia or someplace and are very reluctant, you know, to give up their devotion to reading the Federalist Papers to occupy the White House, we know that that really is not very truthful. You know? I call it counterfactual description of their motivation. And not only was that taken in terms of action, that we were fighting a war with no congressional authorization, no appropriations, the president announced through his Office of Legal Counsel that he has authority to do a reprise. He can reenact Libya anytime he says the national interest could be affected, including regional instability. You know, if you can't find regional instability anywhere on the planet, you got pretty uncreative imagination, right? Which means war at the whim of the president, anytime he identifies some national security interest. And this is, in some sense, the most wrenching departure that we had from the founding generation, who knew war would be irreconcilable with freedom. And as I wrote early on, the instruments that are created to fight against a foreign danger historically are turned against the domestic population to inflict tyranny at home. That's a perfect example of the National Defense Authorization Act. The military now takes over civilian law enforcement, the end of the Posse Comitatus Act. And where's the outrage? Nowhere. The media, no. Congress, no. Hearings, no. Nothing. Just collapse. Well, we're empire. Say, that is exactly what the United States was trying to renounce. Now, one of my successors, John Quincy Adams, who was then Secretary of State, wrote in his 1821 July 4th address to the Congress that our glory was the glory of liberty. Our march was the march of wisdom and knowledge. That others in Europe who were kind of disdainful of the United States at the time, small country still, didn't have huge GNP, no ICBMs, that they said, well, where is your empire? No, not like us. And Quincy Adams rightly responded, it doesn't matter, because the real progress in civilization is the progress of the mind, the progress of liberty, the progress of due process, of giving dignity to every individual, trying to make certain that their standing in life was based upon their merit and their character, not the vestiges of feudalism,